think losing Malta, particularly earlier in the war, means that the British are really going to struggle during these campaigns, and it might well mean that Egypt fell to the Axis.
When Fleet Corps 10 were operating here, 95% of German and Italian supplies got to North Africa. And that drops quite significantly later when obviously the Germans aren't there. But if it had continued for much longer, I don't see how Malta in 1941 would have held out, to tell you the truth.
Do you think the Axis came close to actually capturing Malta? Do you think it could have happened?
It came within an ace, really. If the Ohio had not reached Malta, I think it's quite likely that Malta may have been forced to surrender in September 1942.
But without this diversion and distraction, D-Day becomes very marginal, I would think, in terms of the amount of mobile resources that Germany can bring to combat that sort of invasion.
By April, May 1942, the aerial bombardment of Malta is reckoned to be that Malta is the most bombed place on Earth.
Pearl Harbor, the beaches of Normandy, Stalingrad, all strategic and vital locations that shaped the outcome of the Second World War. But between 1940 and 1942, one tiny Mediterranean island, just 122 square miles of land, became just as significant to the Allied war effort: Malta. Its strategic location along the supply lines for the British to North Africa saw it come under an intense bombardment and some of the fiercest bombing of the entire war. Yet despite 2 years of relentless attacks from the Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force, Malta held firm, and by the end of 1942, the Allies had won out. This is the story of the island that refused to fall. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right at the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. And to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And on today's episode, we're discussing the Siege of Malta during the Second World War, a deadly and unrelenting bombing campaign by the Axis, but one which both Malta and the Allies withstood. Yet what if the island had fallen into enemy hands? Would the rest of the war have looked very different indeed? That's a question for our experts, and joining me today as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and for the first time on the channel, the Professor of Military History at King's College London, Professor Niall Barr. Welcome to you both. Well, first of all, let's just set the scene, and we have in front of us our map of the Mediterranean, and you will see that Malta is in an almost strategically perfect location just south of Sicily, just to the north, of course, of Africa. And as a result, it is really vital for the Allies during the Second World War. Niall Barr, welcome to History Undone. Great to have you on the channel. Do you want to explain a bit more about the significance, the strategic importance of Malta?
So I'm actually going to start by saying when the Second World War begins in September 1939, Malta does not have much strategic significance because Italy is not at war. And in that sense, had Italy stayed out of the war, then Malta would have been an important naval base, but probably no more than such guarding convoys that would inevitably have used the Mediterranean. So it's really when Italy joins the war in June 1940, with France on the verge of collapse, that suddenly the Mediterranean theatre and Malta really looms into sharp focus.
Dr. Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you with me. I mean, I suppose Malta, on one hand, it's a rocky outcrop, it's got no natural resources, but its location has, through history, made it a very desirable piece of land.
Well, yes, I mean, I think everybody can see that it's midway between Gibraltar and Alexandria, two key points in the British Empire. At this time, it enables you to dominate the narrow sea here between Sicily and Africa. But the ironic thing is that before the Second World War, the British government considered it to be indefensible. So they didn't invest in its defences at all. And right at the start of the war, the Mediterranean fleet was moved from Malta to Alexandria. And the Maltese justifiably said, well, hang on, you don't really care about us, do you? And as Niall says, it's only the collapse of France in June 1940 and the opportunist entry into the War of Italy that suddenly makes Malta very important. Because whereas you had sort of naval parity between the British and the French and the Italians before the war, I'd say the Italians probably were superior in terms of aircraft and submarines. You've now got a massive imbalance now with the Italian fleet, and whatever people say about the Italian fleet, they're probably the best built warships in the Second World War. The Italians know how to build these ships. They're not as well trained, obviously, as the Royal Navy, but with France out of the war, it makes this whole area very vulnerable indeed. And the communications, obviously, between Gibraltar and Alexandria and the whole British way in which they can dominate the Mediterranean Sea just disappears overnight the minute Italy enters the war. The second part of this, of course, is that Italy decides it wants to pursue its imperial ambitions in North Africa, and it puts the 10th Army in there to contest Libya and possibly Egypt, where the British are, of course. And then that makes Malta important, both in terms of a defensive base, where you can actually have sort of aircraft and submarines in particular that can actually interdict the supply lines that the Italians are using in both directions. And at some stage, you're thinking, well, actually, we need to use this for our ships that are going backwards and forwards and our own supply routes between both ends of the Mediterranean. And so suddenly, as Niall says, it assumes huge importance. The real problem is without investing in the defence of the place, you're facing quite significant air power from Italy. And again, some of their bombers and fighters, particularly the Macchi 202, is a really good aircraft. And so what have they got at the start of the war? They've got 6 Gloucester Gladiators and 6 in crates, of which 3 at any time are serviceable. And they call them Faith, Hope and Charity.
Which says quite a lot.
Yeah, and only one of them generally is available. So you've got 6 plus 6 Gloucester Gladiators, you've got the whole Italian Air Force, you've got a very powerful Italian Navy, and essentially the British Mediterranean fleet says, well, how do we deal with that? And we can talk about that later on.
So, Niall, once the Italians enter the war in 1940, does it then become immediately inevitable that Malta will be under siege by the Italians quite quickly?
It's certainly inevitable that Malta will be under attack. And the Italians mount their first raids on Malta very soon after the declaration of war. But there's almost a slow realisation on both sides of Malta's importance. It's not entirely overnight. And of course, the British naval staffs before the war had thought, well, we may well evacuate Malta because of the power of Italian air attacks. And actually, they find that the Italian level bombing can be fended off. It's not particularly accurate.
And they do it from 20,000 feet as well, which is obviously not great.
That ships can actually still reach Malta. So there's almost there's a cat and mouse game that goes on through 1940, and there's very much a heated debate within the naval staffs as to how much to support Malta, how to get supplies and defences in, but then exactly how to defend the island against what become quite concentrated air attacks.
I think it's important to recognise that if you're engaged in campaigning in North Africa, it suddenly assumes huge importance because it gives you safe space, if you like, from which to operate. You can not only interdict essentially the ships that are supporting the Italian campaign from Italy, you can also use your aircraft. Now, the range of aircraft from here is quite significant. They're not here at the time, but for example, if you use Wellington and Blenheim bombers, they can actually bomb this whole area on this map in North Africa. They can also go, the Blenheims can go almost as far as northern Italy. The Wellingtons can reach Rome and also southern Greece and Crete as well. So if you actually can base your aircraft there, you've got quite a powerful capability to be able to interrupt what is going on in North Africa.
And is the plan here just to bomb Malta into submission, to basically force the Maltese people into a surrender? Is that the idea?
So I think initially the Italians think that Malta may well surrender, and their agents in Malta suggest that the Maltese population may be open to that. In fact, of course, once Malta is brought under bombardment, it has absolutely the reverse effect. And Malta becomes, for the Italians, it becomes a thorn in their side, but they're never quite sure whether it's worth the effort to pluck the thorn out or just leave it there. And that's part of the problem. Throughout the rest of the campaign in the Mediterranean, the Axis, the Italians, then the Axis, the Italians and the Germans, they constantly think about operations against Malta, but they never invest it with perhaps the importance that it actually deserved.
I mean, the Italians did have a plan before the war in 1938 to land 40,000 troops in Malta. It's then downgraded to 20,000 troops. And then, of course, as the war starts, they get very windy about various things, and certain actions with the Royal Navy make their admirals say, well, actually, this is a bit risky. I don't know if we're going to do that. And it's not until 1942, when, as Niall hints, the Germans are involved, that any serious consideration of a direct assault on Malta takes place. So the aggressive approach of the Royal Navy early on, particularly the raid on Taranto in November 1940, makes the Italians very nervous about actually putting their ships at sea without thoroughly bombing and reducing the island. And you know, the philosophy is we'll bomb them and we'll also put them under siege, we'll starve them out as well, is how it goes. I think it's probably worth mentioning that there's about 260,000 population on the islands. Most of them are concentrated within about 5 miles of Grand Harbour, which is where Valletta and the 3 cities of Birgu, Conspicuo and Vittoriosa are. And so a lot of the bombing is concentrated in that area before the population disperses. But it's got reasonable historic fortifications. It's got very soft sandstone, which you can actually burrow underground in. And later on, of course, people learn to survive amid probably the most intense bombing, Neil, I'd say, in terms of intensity, in terms within a limited sort of distance in the whole of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by April, May 1942, the aerial bombardment of Malta is reckoned to be that Malta is the most bombed place on Earth. The fact that it is rocky, the fact that shelters can be built really makes a huge difference. But conditions for the Maltese population are very grim.
Kesselring, I think it says, I've got nothing left to bomb in 1942.
Yeah, and we'll come on to the remarkable bravery and resilience of the Maltese people in due course. That's some of the background there. Let's zoom in now and focus on the events of the Siege of Malta itself. Okay, so before we get into the specifics of the siege itself, let's just run through some of the key statistics. Between 1940 and 1944, the island was bombed 3,343 times. This includes what is still the record for the heaviest period of sustained bombing of all time, 154 consecutive days and nights, with around 6,700 bombs being dropped. In total, 15,000 tons of bombs fell on Malta, over 2,357 hours of air raids. The country suffered 1,581 civilian casualties, 7,500 military and merchant casualties, with another 3,780 injured. 10,761 buildings were destroyed or extensively damaged, yet 390,660 tons of Axis shipping was sunk and over 241 enemy aircraft destroyed. I mean, it was obviously absolutely unrelenting, the bombardment of Malta during the Second World War. We've got a new map in front of us now showing the main island of Malta. It's worth saying, of course, there's also the island of Gozo as well. Here is the capital, Valletta. You can see these red areas are key airfields and runways. Chris, do you want to talk to us a bit about the geography at the time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, right at the heart of Malta is Grand Harbour here, probably one of the greatest natural harbours in the Mediterranean. And you've got 2 bits of it, either side here, Salima Creek and Grand Harbour, either side of Valletta, which can take basically the whole Mediterranean fleet if you want it to. It's got extensive repair facilities. You've got these 3 airfields here. Most of it's rural. So population of 250, 260,000 is spread throughout this area, but most of them are concentrated around Grand Harbour. As I said earlier, most live within 5 miles of Grand Harbour. The 3 cities on this side, Borgo Vittorioso and Conspicua, they've got about 28,000 people in. And of course, the target of most of the Italian air campaign in the early stages of the war from June 1940 are concentrated on the repair facilities, the harbour, and of course the airfields. And the key thing for the Allies is to get enough air power in to be able to continue to defend the island against these air attacks before these bombing missions can actually devastate the whole area. At the same time, we want to look for the opportunities to take offensive action with submarines. They're based here in Salima Creek off Manol Island in particular, to interrupt the Italian supply lines to North Africa. And when we can, to get surface ships in there as well with supplies, with fuel, with kerosene in particular, food, and all the other things you need to wage war. And remember, we're playing catch up because we didn't think we were going to hold Malta. It's really vitally important now. And at the same time, we use it as a staging post to put aircraft, supplies and other things into North Africa to be able to fight against the Italian 10th Army that is there.
So, Neil, the siege begins in 1940, and to begin with, it is just the Italians who are leading it. The Luftwaffe don't get involved until 1941. Do you want to tell us a bit about those early stages of the siege?
So the early stages are ones really of British success in 1940 and into 1941, where the defences of Malta are thickened up, where offensive air units are brought in, where submarines are based in Malta, and can start interdicting Axis supply lines. So 1940 is a relatively quiet period for the island, one in which certainly the British are building up their supplies and forces, and the Italians are weighing up how much of a problem Malta might be. But in 1940, the Italians have, not to put too fine a point on it, have bitten off more than they can chew. Mussolini declares war without reference to the Italian chiefs of staff. They're completely caught by surprise. The campaign in North Africa, after Graziani's army moves forwards in September 1940, grinds to a halt at Sidi Barrani. And not content with that, Mussolini then decides that he will declare war on Greece in October 1940, a campaign which almost immediately goes badly wrong. So Malta isn't the centre of Italian attention in 1940. They have more than enough to do in North Africa and in the Balkans. And Chris has already mentioned the Taranto raid in November 1940, which does significant damage to the Italian fleet. There's a number of fleet actions in 1940 which really see the Royal Navy seize the initiative from the Italian Navy. And that's with the Royal Navy being undergunned and outmatched, but actually through that aggressive action really dominating the central Mediterranean. So 1940 is a period of broad success, and it lays the foundations for what is to come.
It's interesting you mentioned earlier, Neil, how almost as the war goes on, both sides realise how significant Malta is, and that probably brings us into 1941 when the Luftwaffe do get involved. What is it that makes the Germans go, you know what, we need to focus our attentions on Malta? Well,
the Germans realise the Italians need rescuing in North Africa, and famously, the Germans deployed the Africa Corps under Rommel in February 1941, and along with that they bring along Fliegerkorps 10, which is a very experienced flying formation, bombers and fighters, predominantly Stukas, and they're very good at bombing this sort of target. They deploy to Sicily in support of the Africa Corps, and suddenly Malta comes under very serious systematic attack, not just from the Italians. And we shouldn't forget the Italians continue to bomb at the same time as the Germans, but the Germans are much more accurate, much more effective. They even encourage the Italians to fly really low to drop their bombs. But by and large, the addition of Fliegerkorps 10, with these vastly experienced pilots and aircrew who've come fresh from the Battle of France, fresh from Norway and places like that, you see an immediate difference. And I'm afraid to say quite a lot of British aircraft are bombed on the ground. These airfields take a hell of a pounding, and the whole area around Grand Harbour, including the ships that happen to be in it, come under sustained attack. In addition, the supply ships that are coming from Alexandria and from Gibraltar also start getting hit, and you see Italian submarines and German mines being laid in huge numbers around the island. Up to 54,000 mines are laid by aircraft, surface ships and Italian submarines. So for our submarines operating here, it's becoming increasingly dangerous to actually go out and off North Africa as well. More mines are laid. And it's designed really to pen everybody in, to starve and bomb Malta into submission.
And Neil, give us a sense of what life would have been like for the Maltese people during this period, who presumably are at risk of potential starvation if there are issues with food supply. And you've also got this very, very intense bombing period, more intense even than the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. So what was it like? What was day-to-day life like for the Maltese people? So
the intense period of bombing is really 1942. And it makes life very, very difficult indeed, because there are Axis air raids almost every day, and of course during the summer in the Mediterranean, the skies are always clear. You can expect Axis raids all the time, and so people begin to live primarily underground and often on extremely short rations. By the summer of 1942, a Maltese male is on 1,600 calories per day, so well below that required for a normal, healthy life. So conditions then are very grim indeed. And it's really a case of whenever the British attempt to send in a convoy and it fails, that has a massive impact on the civilian population.
I think it's worth mentioning that we're trying to get aircraft in here all the time. So you've had some swordfish come in, swordfish aircraft, anti-shipping aircraft that have basically escaped from France when it was taken over by the Germans. They've flown in. We're trying to get Hurricanes in. We're ferrying those in. They're not top-line aircraft. You know, they're not going to compete against the 202s that well, or indeed against the Bf-109s, particularly the Bf-109s in Flieger Corps 10. And so the Hurricanes in particular are up against it. Quite a lot of them get bombed on the ground because there's nowhere to hide them, and the airfields are being targeted. But all the while, we're trying to get as many Hurricanes in particular in to fight against these air attacks. And we're not doing that well, to tell you the truth, because Flieger Corps 10 is incredibly effective, as you might expect. And it's only when we see the switch of some of these German squadrons away, not only to support Rommel in North Africa, but also to obviously take part in the invasion of Yugoslavia, which takes place later in the summer. And then, of course, Barbarossa starts in June 1941. So essentially, the Germans go away again. The Italians resume their primacy in this. And at that point, our submarines and aircraft are able to get out and start attacking Axis shipping as well, particularly the supply routes to North Africa. Just to give you an indication, when Flieger Corps 10 were operating here, 95% of German and Italian supplies got to North Africa. And that drops quite significantly later when obviously the Germans aren't there. But if it had continued for much longer, I don't see how Malta in 1941 would have held out, to tell you the truth.
Go on now.
So it's this shifting dynamic, often caused by other events in the war or other theatres, that mean that the Axis take their eye off Malta. So in the summer of 1941, as Chris has said, German attention is fully focused on Operation Barbarossa, and Flieger Corps 10 that was spared for the Mediterranean, makes this huge impact, is then withdrawn. So the summer of 1941, again, is a British period. Merchant ships do get through, the island is supplied.
And we get more aircraft in. So we use aircraft carriers to ferry aircraft in, and they fly in from range. even later on, the USS Wasp appears and actually flies aircraft in for us. So it's a constant battle to try and get supplies and aircraft in here to hold the island. But as Niall says, the point of emphasis for both sides depends on what's happening elsewhere.
Yes.
And so it's important sort of veers and hauls all the time, depending on where the point of impact is.
So again, it's this complex dynamic between defence of the island, being able to attack, and then having some of that interdiction assets suppressed. So at any one time, Malta can actually be faring okay, and then actually very quickly, if the Axis decide that now is the time to suppress it, its importance can diminish. And I think it's because of that complex dynamic of attack, defence, and interdiction that means that the Axis never make up their mind to really deal with the problem.
And presumably at the same time that the Axis are starting to realise the strategic significance of Malta, the Allies are also all the time going, you know what, this is really valuable here, we need to hold on to it.
So one of the key features of Malta, which is often missed in the history, because the aeronaval battle that goes on around Malta is so complex in itself. But one of the key features of Malta is it becomes an absolutely invaluable listening post in terms of radio intelligence. So not only listening into Italian radio traffic, which then and the signals can then be sent back to Bletchley Park for decryption. But Malta also acts as a staging post for Enigma decrypts and intelligence staged through Malta then to Egypt. And that sort of hidden radio and electronic war in many respects makes Malta, as the war goes on, even more valuable.
I think what's also important is some of the lessons from the Battle of Britain come here. We have an Air Marshal come in called Hugh Lloyd, and he totally reorientates the way defensive aircraft are used from these airfields. He famously said, you know, it's not about the dog in the fight, it's about the fight in the dog. And that's what he has on a sign outside his office. And he totally revolutionises the way that air defence is done. So they introduce a formation called the Finger Four for the Hurricanes, because they know they're up against it with these Bf-109s. And a Finger Four basically is 3 aircraft with the leader in the point, 2 aircraft on the starboard quarter and 1 on the port quarter. And what they used to do is send 3 of these formations up. 1 would take out the fighters, the other would take out the close escort, and the 3rd element would take out the bombers. And this revolutionises the way they can get aircraft in the air and actually deal with these incoming raids. And there's quite significant losses sustained by the Italians in particular, because of the way that they operate, but also amongst the Germans as well. So that starts to roll back the initiative. But we should say the Hurricane is absolutely underperforming against the Bf-109. And in fact, you get situations where Fliegerkorps 10 Bf-109 pilots waggle their wings in front of the Hurricane saying, look how good we are, and really taking the mickey. And it annoys everybody. And people realise unless we get Spitfires in here that can outperform these aircraft, we're not going to prevail, and we're going to lose a lot more Hurricanes on the way. And I think one of the things that we need to understand is how vulnerable these airfields are. They're constantly being bombed. We lose a lot of aircraft on the ground, and the ability to generate basically sorties into the air is really difficult. And Hugh Lloyd makes a real difference. And later, in 1942, we get the arrival of Keith Park, of course, a major player in the Battle of Britain, who again takes it forward with Spitfires and starts to get the initiative back again. Yeah,
I want to come on to the end of the siege in a moment and Operation Pedestal, which is really key. Just first, Niall, it's worth saying, of course, in 1942, the King decides to award the Maltese people the George Cross for their bravery during the siege.
Absolutely. I think there's a real recognition, both amongst the military garrison and the military commanders, just what the Maltese people are undergoing. And conditions on the island, you know, as we've been talking about, in 1940 and 1941 are bearable. By the spring of 1942, they really are very, very bad indeed. And the failure of the Operation Harpoon and Operation Vigorous in June 1942.
These are convoys coming from east and west, so you've got from Alexandria and also from Gibraltar. Yeah.
Which would have brought in much needed supplies. That's really when the rations of the Maltese people and indeed the garrison are cut below really a living amount. And so it's in that context that the King awards the island the George Medal, and never has it been better merited.
I mean, you've got a real crisis in 1942. As Niall says, the island's running out of kerosene, it's running out of supplies, it's running out of food. But there's also another issue. The Germans are actually considering invading the island. There's an Operation Hercules that they discussed. It's going to be an Italian airborne division. It's going to be a German airborne division, followed up by 3 divisions brought in by a sea. But before that, there's a huge bombardment. They soften up. The convoys aren't getting through. And of course, our submarines are penned in, our offensive air is penned in. Why? Because the Germans thought they were winning Barbarossa, and another Fliegerkorps arrives, Fliegerkorps 2 this time. And every time the Germans bring a Fliegerkorps in, the island's under real pressure, and all our offensive operations are really curtailed. And in 1942, we're losing a lot of submarines to mines as well. In all, the whole campaign around Malta, we lost 38 submarines, including some absolute aces, HMS Urge, HMS Upholder, these very small submarines operating particularly off the North African coast. And we mustn't forget, this is not just about defending Malta, it's about projecting fighting power into North Africa to fight Rommel and the Afrika Korps as well. So this is a very dynamic space in 1942. They've got the threat of invasion coming. We picked that up from intelligence, as Niall hinted. Why didn't they do it? Because Rommel said, I want to concentrate in North Africa. And Hitler said, I remember Crete. That didn't go so well with airborne troops, did it? And maybe we won't do it this year. But Kesselring, who basically is given command of this area in the south, and with Fliegerkorps 2, really wants to press on, really bombard this island into submission. Let's get the invasion going forward on it. But the emphasis is North Africa. Let's deal with that. And they actually say in their meetings, in the meetings with Hitler, it'll wither on the vine. We don't have to worry about Malta if North Africa's taken.
So if I can provide a slightly different perspective there, in the sense that the Axis finally come up with an agreed strategy,
right,
which is Operation Hercules. And the disagreements between the Italians and the German high commands are legion throughout the war. This time they finally agree that the island will be suppressed, and that's the period of very heavy bombing in April-May 1942. That when Rommel has defeated the 8th Army at the Gazala line down in Libya in June 1942, then his army is to stop, is to halt. All of the Axis air forces that have been supporting him will then move in for the assault on Malta. Now, the problem is, of course, that Rommel doesn't just win the Battle of Gazala.
Yeah, that's right.
It's an absolute catastrophe for the British 8th Army. It leads to the loss of Tobruk and basically the retreat or rout of the 8th Army back to El Alamein, just 70 miles from Alexandria. But it's in that context that Rommel believes this is his one chance to seize Alexandria.
Yep.
So if he doesn't go now, it's going to be too late. And he signals Hitler and says, so he completely short circuits the strategy and all of the campaign plan, speaks to Hitler directly or signals Hitler directly, and gains Hitler's permission to go on. So what had been a very well thought out strategy then is completely broken apart. And of course, what Rommel doesn't think about, what he doesn't consider at that point, is that leaving Malta in his rear while charging off across into Egypt, if Malta then reactivates, he's going to be in big trouble.
Yeah.
But if we look at how difficult Operation Hercules would have been just for a moment, the first thing you can really spot from Malta, a very pleasant island as it is, it has a wonderful port, it has no beaches, not almost no beaches.
That's right.
Almost no beaches.
I've been on that beach.
This is not going to be an amphibious landing. It has to be an airborne assault.
Yeah.
And Malta, being very rural and having soft sandstone, is literally covered in stone walls, small stone walls marking out the fields. Those are the kinds of conditions that paratroops really do not want to land in.
Not gliders either.
Yeah.
It has an inbuilt anti-glider defence. You cannot land gliders apart from the airfields. Now, obviously, they're going to be protected. Your paratroops, when they land, they're certainly, the estimates were that they were going to suffer far more casualties from broken legs and ankles. So this is a really tough nut to crack. Now, the Italian Folgore division and the German Ramka parachute brigade, they've been training intensively. They're ready to go. But when Rommel hears off into the desert, Hitler certainly is not unhappy that this operation is cancelled. In many respects, the Axis mines aren't concentrated by even the problems that the paratroops would have. It's the fact that Hitler doesn't believe that the Italian fleet will sortie and provide protection for the amphibious force that would have followed on into the Grand Harbour. And so it's actually, ultimately, it's about the lack of trust between the Axis partners that leads to Operation Hercules being postponed indefinitely.
And the Italian Navy is short of fuel as well. Quite a lot of the fuel coming out of Romania is going straight to the Germans in support of Barbarossa and also the German Navy. And so you're seeing quite a lot of the Italian Navy well north, because they've been, Andrew Cunningham's aggressive actions in the Mediterranean have led to most of the Italian fleet being up at Naples rather than in the south at Taranto. Obviously, the attack on Taranto didn't help either. Had the Battle of Cape Matapan, and you've got constant interdiction of Italian warships and merchant ships. Now, 78% of Italian merchant ships in the Mediterranean were destroyed, mostly by aircraft operating from Malta. So Neil's right. This is a difficult approach. The Italians are very windy about this, even if the Germans are keen. But you're absolutely right, Neil. It was the success in North Africa which said, well, why are we bothering? Should stress at this point, I think, James, that Rommel's supply lines go basically west and east of Malta. And those supply lines become even more exposed once he gets forward at Benghazi and Tobruk. So they've got to come from Greece, they've got to come from southern Italy and places like that, before most of the interdiction was taking place to the west.
Yeah.
So you've got much more opportunity now to interdict his fuel and other supplies. And as Fliegerkorps 2 is actually withdrawn to support Rommel and in other operations, the opportunities for the submarines and aircraft massively increase. And Rommel's supply lines come under very serious threat. And we see a complete drop-off in the ability of him to supply particularly fuel to his troops.
And we'll come on to the points about Rommel and the impact on the North African campaign in due course. Just to round up the siege itself, do you want to talk us through, Neil, Operation Pedestal and the end of the siege?
Operation Pedestal is really the last gasp attempt to resupply Malta, with Harpoon and Vigorous convoys failing in June. The British are absolutely aware that Malta has only a few weeks of supplies remaining. And without resupply, the island will be forced to surrender no later than the 1st of September. Churchill himself believes by this stage that this would be a catastrophe. And so Britain puts planning effort into the largest resupply operation, one of the largest fleets that the Royal Navy has ever put to sea, in order to fight through a convoy from Gibraltar to Malta. So the stakes for Pedestal could not be higher. And given the Axis intelligence as well, the Axis are actually well aware that the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine will be mounting this convoy in August. So it's a very, very large convoy, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
And there is some bombing that still happens after 1942, but in essence, the Siege of Malta during the Second World War is 1940 to 42.
Essentially what happens, I mean, Pedestal just about delivers enough fuel oil and other supplies. There's the famous iconic image of the Ohio strapped alongside a destroyer to stop it sinking as it comes into Grand Harbour. And so what happens after that, of course, is governed really by what's happening in North Africa, because towards the autumn of 1942, you get El Alamein occurring in November, of course, and you also have Operation Torch in North Africa taking place. And so the whole focus has shifted to there. But what's happened in Malta in the meantime is we've actually put a lot more Spitfires and other aircraft into Malta by this stage. As I said earlier, Keith Park is now running the air campaign. You've got offensive aircraft, Wellingtons in particular, Blenheims, Beauforts, ranging far and wide from the island itself. And it destroys, essentially, alongside the submarines, Rommel's supply base. There's no question about that. And he's so underconfident of actually getting fuel in time for an action, he goes without it and gets defeated in detail at that point. And so Malta's role at this stage is not just about survival, it's about actually being a highly offensive base for really stopping Rommel in its tracks, both by air and by submarine, by dislocating his logistics.
Well, there we go. That is the real history of what happened during the Siege of Malta. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, well, let's ask ourselves some big what-ifs had Malta fallen during the Second World War. Niall, to start with you, do you think the Axis came close to actually capturing Malta? Do you think it could have happened?
It came within an ace, really. Operation Pedestal is an Axis tactical victory. They sink lots and lots of ships, but the tanker Ohio manages to get in. And it's the fuel on the Ohio that makes the difference. That's the kerosene that keeps the aircraft flying. So if the Ohio had not reached Malta, I think it's quite likely that Malta may have been forced to surrender in September 1942. Now, by that stage, of course, actually Rommel's army in North Africa is in real trouble because he's advanced well beyond his supportable supply lines. He's now, I can't quite, there's El Alamein somewhere around there. He's at the end of a 1,500-mile supply line.
Yes.
So by September, October, the 8th Army, now under the command of Bernard Montgomery, is building up for a major offensive. And in that sense, if Malta surrenders in September 1942, I think the turn of the tide, as it's often known, at Alamein is probably going to happen anyway. The point is that because Malta can interdict the Axis supply lines to Tripoli, Benghazi and Tobruk, it's in that period of August, September, October, when using Enigma decrypts and intelligence, the flights out of Malta, they target the tankers. They can't sink all of the Axis ships, they target the fuel ships. And that's what ultimately strands Rommel in the desert and limits his both operational and tactical opportunities. So even in September 1942, the fall of Malta would still have been significant.
And Chris, of course, it could have happened long before then. I mean, you've had, major world powers like France surrendering within a matter of weeks of the Germans arriving. The fact that you've got this tiny island and the people bravely holding out is almost miraculous. So it's perfectly feasible that in 1940 or 1941, Malta could have fallen to the Axis powers. Well,
even before that, I think possibly without Churchill, they'd have given up the island anyway. The French said, why don't we give Malta to the Italians to keep them out of the war? And Churchill said, absolutely not. Now, I think there are circumstances under Chamberlain where that could have happened. So we might even have surrendered it without a fight. But you're absolutely right, James. Without Malta being there, we lose control of the Mediterranean. There's no question about that. We're stuck in Alexandria and Gibraltar, and the whole central Mediterranean is lost to us. There's no question about that. So how does the North African campaign go then, when you've got unlimited supplies coming across the central Mediterranean and very, very limited opportunities to interdict here? So without Malta being there, the whole campaign in the Mediterranean collapses. We have to go all the way around Africa if we want to come to Alexandria and reinforce. Of course, you'd have U-boats along the route there, and indeed you did later have U-boats on that route, interdicting that. The whole shape of our defence of Egypt and the Middle East and the oil fields, of course, which is quite important to us, and to Hitler in particular, starts to look very marginal indeed.
Yeah, I mean, under that scenario, where Malta has fallen 1940, 1941, does that then mean that Rommel is able to push on much further into Egypt? Does Cairo fall?
I think the issue is that Rommel doesn't push on at that point, he builds up.
OK,
That's the point. He does a reverse, if you like, of what we're doing in Egypt. He's able to do it at his leisure because there's no interference. You've got no air power coming out of Malta. You've got the British Mediterranean fleet, apart from the submarines, not really able to operate. That's the point. And let's turn it around. Imagine if you make that into an offensive base for the Axis. It becomes a real problem for us as well.
Neil, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I'd offer possibly a slightly different perspective, but the period that I would look at in terms of when Malta is really significant, and it's often forgotten about, is actually November 1941.
Yeah.
Where Force K, which is a force of destroyers operating out of Malta, basically stops the Axis sending any convoys to Tripoli. They sink every ship in one convoy, and the Italian command say, we've just got to stop all convoys. Now, this is precisely the time when 8th Army mounts Operation Crusader to try and link up with Tobruk. There is a huge, confused, swirling battle during November and December 1941 around Tobruk. Very heavy casualties on both sides, very, very attritional. But ultimately, Rommel has to withdraw because his sea lines of communication have been completely cut. So that one example really shows how important Malta is. When Malta can be supplied, when it can be rebuilt and have offensive capability, it can do terrible damage to the Axis operations in North Africa. And when we think that some of the battles in North Africa, the margin of success on either side was sometimes pretty slim. When Rommel reaches the Alamein line on the 30th of June 1942, he has 35 tanks. He's at the end of his supply lines. But without the interdiction from Malta, maybe he would have had a few more. The 8th Army at that point is literally in a last stand at Alamein. And in military operations, sometimes the margin of success or failure can be very slim. So I think losing Malta, particularly earlier in the war, means that the British are really going to struggle during these campaigns. And it might well mean that Egypt fell to the Axis.
Here's another what if for you. How does it affect the invasion of Sicily and then Italy? I mean, if you haven't got Malta to play with, does that play out very, very differently?
Well, it depends how you come across North Africa, of course. I mean, this is obviously French, Vichy French territory here. So you're actually coming across here quite rapidly if you want to come through that there. I think the real question is whether a dominant Africa corps can face in two directions. If we're still holding out here, how can you actually deploy that way and that way? Malta then becomes, as I said, the offensive base for the Germans operating on central lines. Maybe Torch definitely happens. I say it happens, actually. I wonder, actually, if Torch would have happened or one of the other options would have taken place. I mean, Churchill was really keen on Greece at one stage, and that certainly wouldn't have happened without Malta. I think the key point comes later. Torch happens, but then if you have to deal with Malta en route to Sicily, you've got a bit of a problem.
So I think it depends when Malta falls.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I think if Malta falls earlier in the war, and the Axis take Egypt, then it's very difficult to speculate on the Allies coming back in North Africa. If Malta falls in August or September 1942, Malta was absolutely vital for the invasion of Sicily.
Correct.
The fighter cover provided from the Maltese bases meant that Sicily became the obvious target for the invasion. So I think if Malta falls in September 1942 and an operation needs to be conducted to retake it, then actually the Allied planners in January 1942, after the success of Torch and the subsequent operations to clear Tunisia, I think Sardinia becomes the target.
Yeah.
Because actually the
Yeah.
fighter cover provided, and it's at the edge of fighter cover, but the fighter cover provided from North Africa to Sardinia makes Sardinia the most likely target. I think Sicily then is not the target.
Yes. And then maybe you go for the south of France, which is always an option, of course.
And of course, the Axis planners, when they were confronted with the defensive problem of are the Allies going to land in Sardinia, Sicily, or the Balkans, they actually thought that Sardinia and the Balkans were the best choices, and that's quite irrespective of Operation Mincemeat.
So if we're saying that Malta falling leads to a prolonged Axis campaign in North Africa and the Mediterranean, are we saying it leads to a longer Second World War? Would you go that far, Chris?
Well, I think it becomes a problem because, on the west wall here, the Germans are building heavy fortifications, and it's the diversion of basically manpower to support and materiel to support Italy, and of course, in a collapsing southern front here. And of course, the surrender of German troops in North Africa that significantly affects the number of divisions they can put in against the D-Day invasion and things like that. So if you've got an Axis-dominated Mediterranean, you can see the problem we've got is we aren't able to divert the resources. I suspect that becomes a very defensible barrier rather than a bridge. That's the point. And we've got to remember that the Axis are in Greece. They're all along the Balkans here in Italy. That's going to be very difficult indeed. And also, if you're a strategic planner, you're going, well, actually, how does this help my overall objective? So you've got a real problem. Where are you going to land to actually put pressure on Germany? Because the key point about D-Day, of course, is the route to Germany is a very short one compared with in the east, which is an extremely long one.
Yeah.
That was always the case. But without this diversion and distraction, D-Day becomes very marginal, I would think, in terms of the amount of mobile resources that Germany can bring to combat that sort of invasion.
Niall?
So I'm going to argue somewhat differently, in the sense that Operation Torch, which was originally codenamed Operation Gymnast, was only one of two Allied plans. The other was Operation Sledgehammer. And that was an immediate cross-channel attack in September 1942. So we may not like the implications, but if the Axis have taken North Africa, then there's no argument about Torch.
Yeah.
Because Torch isn't then going in...
No, not on the agenda.
It's not going in to support the British in North Africa. Now, General George Marshall, he hated the idea of Torch. He even, during the very heated strategic discussions in the summer of 1942, at one point he even threatened to pull the US Army out of Europe and send it to the Pacific. That's how heated the arguments got. So I think without Torch, actually the answer becomes Sledgehammer. And if the Allies decided after Dieppe not to mount Sledgehammer, then the answer becomes a full cross-channel attack in the spring of 1943. So I think it leads to an earlier D-Day, but probably a much less certain D-Day.
Well, indeed, does that succeed? And the other thing I wonder about, Chris, is if the Axis are having far more success in the Mediterranean and North Africa, if potentially they're able to access the oil fields and get natural resources that way, how does that affect Barbarossa? Because presumably then the natural resources of Ukraine, for example, become far less important.
Well, yeah, absolutely, in the Caucasus as well. Well, you raise an interesting point there, James, is, Barbarossa is happening while this is going on, of course. This is taking vast amounts of men and material away to deal with the Soviet Union. So we've also got to bear that in mind. So does that mean that actually the main front becomes the war against the Soviet Union? Instead of doing sledgehammer or an early D-Day, do we say, right, let's let the Russians defeat the Germans, we'll supply them with all the material they need. And of course, we end up then, of course, with the Russians Soviets becoming much further west. We've discussed this before on History Undone, the extent to which Soviet ambitions would have been not to stop, possibly,
yes,
after they've defeated Germany. So it may well have been that, you're right, Neil, the Americans are saying, look, we've got our hands full in the Pacific, we're going to deal with the Pacific. We're not really keen on going across the Channel because of Dieppe and all the other experiences we've had. Let's basically reinforce, let's help the Soviets. Maybe even let's deploy that side of Germany. So you could have seen Allied forces actually coming in this way, so coming round, maybe through Iran, for example, which we've already taken over, and actually helping the Soviets.
Well, there's a thought. Gents, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you both so much. And I think we can say, look, Malta could easily have fallen during the Second World War to the Axis powers, and the fact that it didn't is a testament to the bravery and the determination of the Maltese people, who were rightly awarded the George Cross for their heroism. But had it fallen, it could have had a hugely consequential effect on the rest of the Second World War, not least the effect on the North Africa campaign. Rommel continuing to push maybe into Egypt, maybe the Germans ending up with control over the Suez Canal and some of the natural resources of the Persian oil fields. If that happens, how does that then affect the rest of the Mediterranean campaign? If Malta isn't used as a staging post for the invasion of Sicily, well, do the Allies decide instead to go for Sardinia? Do they completely recalibrate their strategy when it comes to Europe? Do they focus more on the east? What happens with Operation Barbarossa? If the Germans are having success in North Africa and the Mediterranean, do they maybe put less focus on seizing the natural resources of the Balkans and Ukraine? Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from the Siege of Malta in the early part of the 1940s. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Professor Niall Barr for joining me. And of course, thank you to our sponsors, Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.